Great. Thanks, Luis. Hello, everyone. My name is Eric DeCock. I'm the Ascent Project Manager, the consultant team that's working on behalf of the county and the incorporated cities in the region on this regional climate action and adaptation planning project. Before we dive into all the introductions and learning more about the project, I thought what we would do tonight is just in the chat, by way of introduction, learning about who's in the room tonight. And if you could please type into the chat your name, the organization or agency that you're affiliated with, if that's applicable to you. If you don't have an agency or an organization you're affiliated with, that's okay. Feel free to not say anything on that. And the slides have disappeared, Luis, so maybe you can please bring them back.
Yeah, my apologies. I've got to turn on interpretation real quick, and I will.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
And I think the third thing, if I remember correctly from memory, was name a thing that excites you most or a special place that's special to you about Napa County.
There you go.
Favorite place in the region, right? A space that's special to you, a favorite place in the county. All right, so with those things in mind, please go ahead and introduce yourself silently, and we'll be watching as those responses come into the chat. Next slide, please, Luis. So the agenda for tonight really consists of some quick welcome and introductions. We're going to be giving a short overview of the project, the Regional Climate Action and Adaptation Plan. We'll be talking a little bit about the aspects of the plan that have to do the vulnerability of Napa County to climate change, what we call climate vulnerability. We'll also be talking about the greenhouse gas or GHG inventory. We've done an analysis of what kind of greenhouse gas emissions that are causing climate change are present in the county and where they're sourced from in the region as well. We'll be talking about an overview of the proposed greenhouse gas mitigation strategies that we're developing in tandem with the staff and the community. And we definitely want to leave time for questions and answers. And many of you may have questions or comments you would like us to know about. And then we definitely want to leave about half of the time tonight for what we're calling a group activity. We've designed a series of questions to get your feedback. So we'll be making time for that as well. And of course, a quick set of closing comments at the end from staff to talk about what you can expect after tonight. Next slide, please. This is a bit who's in the room today. You heard me. My name is Eric DeCock. I'm the project manager. My name is listed under Ascent, the consulting firm. We're leading this on behalf of the county and the cities. Did want to quickly acknowledge that David Morrison is in the room tonight, the special projects director, who many of you know. We also have Jameson Crosby, a natural resources conservation manager for the county. We have Francis Napchik from program director for Napa RCD, the Resource Conservation District, is in the room, as well as Monique Byro, our community engagement project manager with the RCD. On my team, we have Luis Montes, you've already met, as well as John Stepanek, assistant project manager and climate adaptation specialist here at Ascent. And we also have Olivia Robinson in the room tonight. Her name isn't on the slide, but she was a late ad, and she's an intern with us in our Bay Area office. So welcome, Olivia. Really glad that you were able to join us tonight and assist. Next slide, please. So now it's time to give a short overview. Just what is this project about and where are we at in the schedule? Next slide, please, Luis. Before we dive into all that description, I know we've already used some terms and abbreviations with you all tonight. We just want to do some level setting and make sure everyone's aware of what we mean when we use some of these terms. We have terms like greenhouse gas. You might see that abbreviated sometimes as GHG. And of course, these are the gases emitted by everyday activities with our lifestyles that get trapped in the atmosphere. These are gases that can be naturally caused, but more often when we're worried about human-induced climate change, we're talking about anthropogenic or human-caused greenhouse gases. We also think about climate change as those long-term shifts in temperature and weather patterns that are driven by unnatural levels of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere, primarily produced from burning fossil fuels, but other activities as you'll hear about shortly. We sometimes talk about sustainability, which we define as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Sometimes we'll talk about climate vulnerability or just vulnerability. And when we say that, we're really talking about those specific impacts of climate change on the community and areas in which the community is invulnerable. That may mean that we're unable to cope, or sometimes it may mean the impacts are similar, but they may be unevenly experienced in terms of the severity and the way those impacts are experienced by different types of people in the community. So that's what we mean by vulnerability. Next slide, please, Luis. When we talk about resilience, we're really talking about the capacity of individuals, communities, institutions, businesses, and systems to survive, adapt, and thrive in the face of chronic stresses and acute shocks. That's not dissimilar, but it is distinct from climate adaptation, which are very specific, tailored strategies, if you will, to address the impacts of climate change, knowing that we have to do things differently, we must adapt. But climate adaptation and resilience are, of course, closely connected. Last, you'll hear us talk about mitigation or climate mitigation. What we mean by that is reducing greenhouse gas emissions or reducing our carbon footprint, or really doing what we can to reduce those emissions or to sequester or store them, right? But this is a way we can reduce our carbon footprint on a community-wide basis for all types of greenhouse gas emissions, if you will. We call that mitigation. So moving on from definitions, now that we've done that level setting, we do want to talk a bit about the project and where we're at and what to expect over the next year or so. This climate action and adaptation is a regional plan. It's a roadmap for reducing greenhouse gas emissions countywide in all of the participating jurisdictions, which we'll talk about shortly. The plan is really focused around, first, of course, some of the technical studies already completed to date is identifying existing and projected emissions. Setting greenhouse gas reduction targets, establishing policies and actions to meet those greenhouse gas reduction targets. We want to make sure we integrate climate adaptation and resilience strategies. We've done some studies of climate vulnerabilities, which you'll hear about. And those adaptation and resilience strategies need to be responsive to those points of vulnerability that we've identified. We also definitely are centering a lot of this around community engagement, doing the deeper listening like we're doing this meetings and understanding community concerns and priorities. And then, of course, we want to have a plan that gets implemented. We want to have a robust implementation program to make sure that we're on track to deliver on our targets and achieve some of the broader sustainability and resilience goals that are established in the project. Next slide, please. So who's involved? You heard me mention the county and all the cities. This is a regional collaborative effort. There's no one jurisdiction that is doing all of this work. It's everyone working together. We've got the County of Napa, the City of Napa, City of American Canyon, City of Calistoga, City of St. Helena, and last but not least, the Town of Yountville. So the county and all the cities have been working together collaboratively, as many of you already know, through the efforts of the Climate Action Committee and the Joint Powers Agreement that was set up across these jurisdictions. There's sort of a groundwork laid already for this collaboration effort. And in 2021, each jurisdiction has already adopted their own local commitments to reduce and address climate change. And some of those came in the form of carbon neutrality targets or ambitious goals that were set for how to do that. So just wanted to acknowledge some of this previous efforts by all the participating jurisdictions at the table for this regional planning effort. Next slide, please. So here up on the diagram is just a nice way to show when we think about reducing greenhouse gas emissions and responding to climate vulnerability, we begin to think in terms of how do mitigation and adaptation relate to each other. And obviously, at the end of the process, we want a plan that does both of these things. We want to aggressively mitigate greenhouse gas emissions so that we can reach our carbon neutrality targets in the region. And we also want to make sure that we're being responsive to the impacts of climate change we're already experiencing. So this Venn diagram, if you will, kind of shows that sometimes there's overlap. And you'll hear me talk shortly about a lot of greenhouse gas mitigation strategies and proposed measures that we've already put in front of decision makers for some discussion just last week. And some of those greenhouse gas measures will have adaptive co-benefits, and vice versa. Some of the measures that may appear to seem to be primarily adaptation focused may at times also have emission reduction co-benefits. And so we'll dig into some of that as we talk through the strategies. As you can see on the slide, there's a lot of different symbols and descriptions of what that can look like. But just know that there's a lot of overlap sometimes between the different types of climate strategies that we're proposing to be put into the plan. Next slide, please. So where are we at? Well, we've kicked off the project, we've launched a website, we've completed a number of technical studies which aren't listed on this slide, but we'll talk about them shortly. And we're in really beyond just the kickoff and technical study phase. A lot of those technical studies have wrapped up, and we're now in that more the broader engagement phase of really surveying the community, doing refinement of proposed policy. That's very much still in the early phase. And what we hope to do is by the end of this year that we have a draft regional climate action adaptation plan out for public review, and we're having public meetings and more outreach as you all begin to read that plan and see if it makes sense or if you have any concerns or ideas you would like to see incorporated. And of course, the big idea is that we have a final plan adopted sometime early in 2025. So just noting, of course, we're still not too far down the path. There's more work to be done. And there's still more time for input and comments. So tonight's just the beginning. Next slide, please. We're now going to ask you a series of interactive questions. And Luis, I believe we have a question teed up. But just to get you all prepped, if you have a cell phone or a mobile smartphone on you and you want to scan this QR code, it will take you to a Slido site where we're going to be pushing a series of questions out to you. If you don't feel like engaging in this, that's fine. You can just sit and watch as the results come in. But for those of you that do want to engage, feel free to pull out your smartphones now and scan this QR code, and we'll go from there.
Awesome. Thank you, Eric. Yeah, you can also type into a web browser, slido.com, and enter that number that you see if you'd like to use your computer instead, but a phone also works. So I'll be transitioning us to our next question. All right, so what 1 to 2 words come to mind when you think of a resilient future for the Napa region? And I see some people typing. We'll give it a couple minutes as you think through this question. Seeing that less wildfires been mentioned more than once. It looks like activity, people have entered their comments. Awesome. Well, thanks well, see a couple more people typing. I'll give it 30 more seconds. Achieving sustainability, also something mentioned more than once. Seeing a lot of good stuff around as well.
Great. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for these great responses. It's good to see a diversity of ideas here. I think that speaks to how comprehensive this plan is and just what we hope to expect to hear around your ideas. I know there's some common themes throughout some of this, but there's also a lot of diversity, which we really appreciate as well. Next, let's move on, Luis, to some of the next slides and activities we'll be doing. So we wanted to talk just first of all about some of the results that we've pulled together from our climate vulnerability assessment and some of the top level issues that we know that you're going to be experiencing, and in some cases already are experiencing in this region because of what's happening under climate change. Next slide, Luis. We already know, based on studies we've done and a lot of available information out there, what some of the major impacts of climate change you're already experiencing and are projected to continue experiencing, perhaps on a deeper level. This, of course, begins with the increased temperatures that are directly experienced because of climate change. And notably, as we all experienced throughout California very recently, an increase in the severity and duration of extreme heat events. There's projected increases that are pretty scary over the long term, and so it's just important to know that some of that's been studied and is articulated in detail in our climate vulnerability assessment that's been completed. We also know that drought will increase in severity and duration at times throughout the future, and of course this will lead to some constraints on water supplies, and so there's an important to be mindful of how water will be impacted and its availability in the future in the region. We also know that there is a growing risk of wildfire throughout most of California, and particularly also in Napa County. And of course, with increased wildfire risk, we have risks to people, risks to the built environment, risks to the natural environment and the ecosystem's health throughout the county. And being mindful also of those smoke impacts is also critical from wildfires. We have extreme precipitation. A lot of modeling suggests that there will be increasingly unpredictable times of extreme precipitation, maybe more extreme precipitation events can be expected. We also know that sea level rise will directly impact the southern end of the county as it interfaces with the San Francisco Bay and everything that goes along with that. And of course, also we have the Napa River and its tributaries and some of the increasing flood risks that we could be experiencing in those watersheds. Last but not least, we have a strain on infrastructure, and of course, energy grid resilience is particularly of concern, both in Napa County and throughout the Bay Area, the greater Bay Area region, if you will. So some of that information is also documented in our climate vulnerability assessment. Next slide, Luis.
Awesome. So we have another question for the group. Eric presented on the climate change impacts affecting the Napa region, and now we want to hear from you. What climate change impacts are you most concerned about in the Napa region? We'll give it a minute. We'll give it about 10 more seconds, and then we'll move on to the next slide. Thank you all for participating. All right. Well, that is about a minute. Thanks for participating. I'll kick it off back to you, Eric, for the next slides.
Thanks, Luis. So we have just a few images to show some obvious examples of recent climate-related events. We, of course, have Napa County, as noted earlier, especially the Napa River, has had a history of periodic flooding. And of course, you're doing a lot of work to try to address and mitigate some of that risk, but just acknowledging that there are recent events that we can be mindful of, whether it's the 2019 flooding or previous events that are shown, not here on the slide, but next slide, please, Luis. This is just one, again, of several large and catastrophic fires in your county, and we don't want to minimize how devastating this has been for some of you. Some of you have experienced direct loss, whether it's family members or property, but just acknowledging that these have occurred multiple times in recent decade or so. The Glass Fire is just one very fresh example, along with many others that we could name, and just acknowledging that reality. Next slide, please. There's also drought, including very recently, a 2-year drought that did adversely affect the county and some of your watersheds, including the Napa River, as shown on this slide. Next slide, please. So, the adaptation planning, when we think about the climate adaptation dimension of the Regional Climate Action and Adaptation Plan, we're through that first couple of phases. We've assessed the vulnerability. We've tried to understand what's vulnerable and how vulnerable are different systems in the county, whether that's infrastructure, the environment, society, and we've done some assessment of what we believe the severities of those vulnerabilities are. And really the next phase, which we've already begun, but we are by no means finished, is beginning to identify adaptation strategies that are responsive to those points of vulnerability and some of the most severe impacts that we're aware of and are projected. And so we won't be presenting a lot of details on those strategies tonight, but we definitely, as we get into the group exercise, want to dig really deeply on what the most significant concerns are from your perspective and how we can be sensitive to those as we develop those adaptation strategies and measures. Next slide, please.
All right, and then another question for you all as we continue to dive into this topic. We really want to make sure we're hearing from you as well. How concerned are you about the impacts of climate change in your community? And, by impacts, we mean increased wildfire, extreme heat, flooding, sea level rise. We'll give this one about 30 seconds. I think we can move on to the next, but it's top of mind for many, which is important to recognize as we continue planning through this. Eric, I'll kick it off back to you.
Thanks, Luis. So we want to spend a bit of time talking more on the greenhouse gas mitigation side of the Regional Climate Action and Adaptation Plan. And we'll start just by doing a high-level overview of some of the technical components of the greenhouse gas mitigation studies that have been done. We'll start with the inventory of greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please, Luis. So when we talk about greenhouse gases, for the purposes of the direct primary sources of pollutants, we focus mostly on carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. So as we present numbers today, that's primarily what we're showing you. We do want to acknowledge that there's a separate set of studies that really are just wrapping up at this moment. We just submitted a brand new final version of our short-lived climate pollutants memorandum, which addresses some overlap emissions from what I'm talking about tonight, as well as something called black carbon. Please know, for those of you that are concerned, that that's not being presented tonight. We're really focusing on those primary pollutants that focus on carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. But again, there's a lot more to the story that continues to unfold, and some of that information will be presented at a later date, and we understand that there's ongoing concern. So just want to acknowledge that. Next slide, please. So we do, before I present some of the numbers and graphs in terms of what the inventory results showed, we do want to acknowledge that when we prepare a greenhouse gas emissions inventory, we do something called setting boundaries. And this is done consistent with the protocols that exist for governing local government and community-wide emissions inventories. And it allows local governments to set these boundaries to figure out what emissions to include and what really should probably be excluded, either because of lack of jurisdictional control or because to avoid speculation and moving into a space that's really difficult to say what the scale of emissions would be from those excluded sources. And just for example, you'll see on the slide there's a dashed line, and above that line is what's included, and below the dashed line is what's excluded. And then you'll see there's a jurisdictional boundary and then a broader regional context boundary. Some of the sources that have been excluded in this inventory for the Napa County region are cap and trade covered facilities. There's a series of regulations that are very tightly controlling and reducing emissions in those sectors that's entirely regulated by the state of California. So we tend to exclude those for that reason. We also exclude, for example, refrigerants, because again, they're heavily regulated and the most effective measures are going to come from those statewide regulations on things like refrigerants. Also, in the regional context, we tend to, let's say on the transportation side, include internal to external vehicle trips or trips, trips we drive in our cars where we might start a trip in Napa and end up in a neighboring county and so forth. But we exclude things like pass-through trips. If someone is starting in Solano County and ending up, let's say, in San Francisco, we may not count that trip as it passes through Napa because it doesn't have a beginning and ending point in Napa. So we tend to exclude that. Another thing we tend to exclude is air travel. Aircraft, of course, are fully regulated by the Federal Aviation Administration or the FAA, and there's really no element of local control over those emissions. Even if you have an airport, you do not have jurisdiction over aircraft emissions in the county. Next slide, please, Luis. The other thing we do when we set up an inventory of emissions is we define what sectors are present in the county. And of course, we've identified, as with most places in California, that the primary sectors or sources we want to address are on-road transportation, building energy, solid waste, off-road equipment, agriculture, wastewater, and imported water. And as you can see on the graph as well, the diagram, you can see that there's sort of this idea of a bigger sector, and then within each sector, there's sort of sources of emissions, and then sort of the activities that go with those sources in terms of how do we gather data. And I won't read all the technical details on the slide in the interest of time, but just know that there's a series of methods and protocols that are dictating all of these decisions in these categories we're talking about. Next slide, please. So what do the numbers tell us? And of course, again, this is not accounting for broader studies that are being done and just getting finished. This is just focused on carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. And about 39% of those emissions are sourced from on-road transportation in the region. About 23% are building energy, solid waste emissions at about 16%, off-road emissions, equipment, at 9%, ag at 8%, wastewater 4%, and then a tiny amount, although measurable, from imported water at about a little bit less than 1%. And of course, the total greenhouse gas emissions from those primary pollutants is about 1.2 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. Next slide, please. In terms of how these 1.2 million are apportioned across the different jurisdictional boundaries, from our estimation, we're looking at about 43% of the emissions come from the city of Napa, from the community, about 31% in the unincorporated county, and then of course, smaller tiers as you go down the scale from American Canyon at 16% all the way down to Yountville at about 2% of those regional emissions. Next slide, please. So we're now going to have a quick overview of the greenhouse gas reduction strategies. I know we want to leave time for Q&A, so I'm going to actually go fairly quickly, and I apologize for how fast I'm going to go through this, but we want to make time for Q&A and then have a meaningful amount of time for our group exercise shortly. Next slide, please, Luis. So as we think about emission reduction strategies and where to focus our efforts, we tend to start by looking in the major sectors of emissions within an inventory. So our focus areas are pretty much directly aligned with the sources. So we have things like building energy, transportation. We kind of grouped solid water and solid waste together tonight for sake of the presentation. They are separate focus areas, but we'll talk about them as a group. And then last, but definitely not least, agriculture and open space. Next slide. So in building energy, we definitely want to get at the primary sources, which in this case are residential and non-residential buildings. Residential are homes, apartments, places that people live, of course, and the non-residential buildings is quite broad. It can be a small business, a retail establishment. It could be something as large as a factory or something like a retail establishment, an institutional use like a school. But that's what we mean by non-residential. And strategies, of course, to get at these reductions, we want to decarbonize buildings. And that means getting a lot of fossil fuel usage out of buildings directly, whether that's converting buildings from natural gas to electricity, phasing out those kinds of fossil fuel uses in water heating, in space heating, sometimes in cooking, and those sorts of ideas. There are a series of co-benefits, of course, with all of these types of strategies, and I'm not going to be able to read them all, but I just want folks to know that we've identified some really important, sustainability co-benefits and other types of co-benefits that can really be accrued by engaging in some of these strategies. And we, again, don't have time to get into all those details tonight, but just know they're on the screen for your reading. Next slide, please. Transportation, we're primarily looking at, again, getting at the fuel used in vehicles, equipment, and phasing out fossil fuels over time, as well as reducing vehicle miles traveled from activities that are associated with the different sectors of the economy in the county. And so, of course, in order to do this, we need to provide more mobility options, whether that's investing more in public transit, looking at active transportation, and by that term, active transportation, we're talking about pedestrianizing, looking at encouraging more walking, more biking, and some of that in combination with transit. We also know, again, we need to reduce the amount of trips we make and how much is driving, and really shifting some of those activities to some of those other modes that are a little bit more climate friendly, like I just mentioned. There's definitely a big role for local climate plans to focus on local decisions that support the transition from fossil fuel vehicles to clean vehicles. Things like providing more electric vehicle charging or more clean hydrogen refueling when it becomes available and effective on a clean hydrogen level in the future, for example. We also have an opportunity to decarbonize off-road equipment, whether that's construction equipment, agricultural equipment, and other equipment that's out there. And while some of those technologies are still maturing, there are advances being made, very rapid advances being made for electrifying medium and heavy duty vehicles. We know that's happening, and there's a lot of happening to incentivize some of those transitions over time. Next slide, please. Moving on to water and solid waste. Again, a lot of these emissions in at least the water sector are what the energy that gets used to distribute and pump and treat water, as well as transporting water from longer distances. And then on the waste side, what we're really talking about is a powerful short-lived climate pollutant known as methane. And that methane is generated from the anaerobic decomposition of waste in landfills. And we need to transition away from being landfill reliant towards thinking about getting organic waste out of the waste stream and turning that into compost and other sustainable reuses of that organic waste. Of course, with the water side, there's ways that we can get at that through rebates and doing water audits, thinking about more sustainable native landscaping, thinking about water pricing and all sorts of solutions that are integrated in the water space, and diversifying the sources from which we get our water as well. A lot of we can do in the water space that's also very well integrated with the climate adaptation and resilience side. Don't have time to get into all those details today, but just know we're thinking creatively about those multi-pronged solutions in the water side. And again, on the solid waste side, the solutions do very much have to do with, again, increasing composting, getting that organic waste out of the waste stream, thinking about edible food waste diversion, promoting waste education, and of course, thinking about small but impactful things like implementing reusable foodware at restaurants, for example. Next slide, please. And then last but not least, again, agriculture and open space. We know how vital agriculture is in this region. It's the heart of your economy in terms of grape growing and wine production and everything that's pertinent to that activities. And there are, of course, ways that we can increase sustainability and resilience through agriculture and open space strategies. We know that thinking about reforesting our burned areas is front and center for many. We also think about electrifying agricultural equipment, using different types of solutions for electrifying or creating renewable energy solutions for pumping and biofuels for powering irrigation. A lot of opportunity there. Many in the ag sector are already exploring those options here. We think about increasing sustainable livestock practices, carbon farming, and of course, collaborative work across the community of growers to think about how do we best improve soil health, maybe through carbon farming or other specific components of what carbon farming is all about. So again, a lot of these agriculture and open space measures we know do have direct adaptation and resilience co-benefits. We heard a rich discussion at the Climate Action Committee last week, and a lot of folks are concerned about wildfire mitigation measures as a way to get at both our greenhouse gas reduction and our climate resilience goals. So we're mindful of that. We know there's a lot of opportunity there when we think about wildfire mitigation, improving our forest and landscape health. That really, I think, does, Luis, I believe, concludes my portion of the presentation. I think now we're going to, if I'm not mistaken, moving into Q&A time. So if folks have questions, we encourage you all to raise your hand. We would like to hear from you verbally what questions you have, and we'll take them in the order received at this time. So thanks everyone for listening, and let's hear about the questions that you all have. First up, we have Chris Benz. Hello, Chris.
Hello. I noticed that you didn't go through the vulnerability scores for the different climate change effects. And I noticed that increased wildfire risk is rated a 3 out of 5, yet it seems to be the main concern of most of the people on this call. So I wanted to ask about that, ask about reassessing it, ask if you had contacted Napa Firewise or the ag sector before assigning that, because I think we're all very concerned about that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Chris. And I know that some of the scores may feel counterintuitive to some readers, and we, of course, can't always change them or be open to sort of reframing what they mean. I think one of the findings that we had was a lot of the lessons learned following some of your very large and catastrophic fires in the region have led to a lot of planning and a lot of programs that are just now getting underway, but have not yet necessarily resulted in physical changes on the ground to mitigate fire hazards and to reduce risk to life and property. So in our estimation, you've done a lot of the work and through your organizations like Napa Firewise, some of the hazard mitigation planning that's very recently updated plans. But if in collective estimation and community feedback, we still feel like that score is too low, there's always an opportunity to change based on what we're hearing. So I appreciate the flag on that, and we'll take that into consideration as we start to work on the adaptation strategies. Does anybody else have questions that they'd like to ask verbally? I'm not seeing any hands. So Luis, I have not been actively monitoring the chat. I've been talking. So if there's any questions in the chat, please let me know and maybe we could go to those.
This is Lori Stanley. I can't find my raised hand. Would it be okay if I asked a question?
Sure.
Great, thank you so much. As I was reading through the memo about the GHG measures, under the timeline of implementation and completion, I didn't see any mention of the net zero climate pollutants by 2030 deadline as the reduction target. And I'm aware as a parent of the urgency of this time, and of all of the jurisdictions already have their commitment on 2030, and that the addendum back on September 27th, 2023 that discussed the purpose of the RCAAP said that it was to prepare a completion plan for all the jurisdictions to achieve the goal of carbon neutrality by the year 2030. So I'm just wondering why that goal is not listed. Thank you so much.
Yeah, appreciate that question. David, I'm going to have you respond to this question because, as you know, we have not yet engaged in any target analysis relative to adopted policy or projected emissions beyond 2030. So I did want to defer to you on this question. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Eric. I want to point out the complete direction that was given by the CAC in sending out the request for proposals to engage Ascent in preparing this plan. It says the purpose of the regional climate adaptation plan is to prepare a comprehensive plan to achieve the goal of net carbon neutrality or net zero greenhouse gases by the year 2030. That is correct. The next sentence, however, says, in addition, given the potential barriers and challenges to achieving this goal, because it is a very difficult and expensive goal to achieve, and in some cases, achieving that goal requires state and federal action that we cannot require. Proposals will also include a comprehensive plan that achieves net zero emissions as soon as possible after 2030 or by 2045 at the latest. 2045 is the state of California goal for net zero. 2050 is the UN goal for net zero. So even by saying 2030 or as soon as as possible, soon thereafter as possible, we're being much more aggressive than either the state of California, the United States, or the UN. And then similarly, in another portion of the RFP, it does talk about, and the RFP was approved by the CAC, that again, the goal is to achieve net zero by 2030, including a comprehensive plan that achieves net zero as soon as possible after 2030 or by 2045 at the latest. So when people say 2030 is the goal, that is certainly some of the individual jurisdictions' goals. And it is the goal of this climate action plan. But it also recognizes that rebuilding 60,000 houses or removing 100,000 cars from the streets in Napa County is going to be extremely difficult in only 3.5 years now. And so we also are looking at other options to provide the decision makers so they have a full range of alternatives to consider when they start setting these policies and measures.
Thanks, David, for that response. Does anybody else have questions that you'd like to ask before we move into the group exercise? I'm not seeing any new activity in the chat. And if I don't see hands, I guess that might mean we've answered everyone's questions for now.
Yeah, if there are no questions, I think we can maybe transition into the group activity. Let me share my screen to get that started. All right. All right, so I will be transitioning us to the group activity where we want to hear from you and understand, what is important or a priority for you and your community. So I'll provide a bit of an overview to the activity and then some directions on how to access it. And then we'll split up into groups and have a deeper conversation on some of these topics. So a quick overview of the discussion topics and the activity. So today we will be discussing 3 different topic areas and identifying vulnerabilities and strengths amongst all 3. The topic areas are infrastructure. So examples of that are buildings, houses, bridges, utilities. The next topic is societal. So thinking about healthcare, food, emergency response, the economy. And then the third topic will be environmental. So air quality, recreation, floodplains, invasive species. And across all of these topics, we want to consider a few things. So ideas for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, the effects of extreme heat, flooding, wildfire, and drought on some of these, and then resources and support that might be required to address any challenges or concerns that may come up. So I want to make sure everyone has access. We will be using the mural board to conduct this activity, and I am going to paste a link into the chat. One second. All right, so I am sharing a link that will direct you to where the group activity will be conducted. Please select that link and open it in order to access the activity. You'll be prompted to join as a visitor. Please select view as a visitor, and then step 3, you'll be able to enter your name, or you can leave the anonymous name that it provides for you. So open the link, select view as visitor, and then enter your name, and you'll be prompted to join a page that looks like this. And these are where the breakout rooms will be conducted. Once I open the breakout rooms, you'll end up zooming in on your appropriate breakout group. And there will be facilitators and note takers to help guide you if you have any questions once I open up the breakout rooms. And if you were to zoom in a little bit further, you'll see posters, each with different topics, like I discussed. This one is showing infrastructure vulnerabilities. You'll see that there are 2 questions at the top. The first question is, what concerns do you have about each feature's ability to reduce GHG emissions or adapt to climate change impacts, such as extreme heat, flooding, drought, and fire? And then we want to identify some solutions. So the next question is, what resources or support are needed to address these concerns? And on the left-hand side, you'll see a list of features. These are intended to help stimulate conversation and get thoughts around these, but by no means do they have to be focused on these. If you have thoughts about other concerns or vulnerabilities that are outside of what's listed here, we definitely want to hear them, and I encourage you to share them. That is why we included some empty rows on the bottom, is because we know that thoughts and ideas might fall outside of some of these listed features. And I just want to flag that participants will have view-only access. So we encourage you to raise your hands by using the raised hand function, or typing your comments into the chat to share your thoughts. And we'll make sure that they get captured in the mural board. And before we get started, I just want to set some ground rules to make sure we are all on the same page. We do want to hear from everyone. So just as a reminder, be here now, one speaker at a time. Step up to voice your thoughts. Step back to let others speak as well. Be additive, not repetitive. Listen actively, seek to understand, keep an open mind. Help the facilitator keep things on time. So we will have about the next 55 minutes to conduct this activity. There are 4 parts to it. And I am going to stop sharing my screen so I can open up the groups. So just give me 1 minute. I do want to let people know that if you need Spanish interpretation, that is available, and we do have a unique, a group where it will be facilitated in Spanish. So if you could raise your hand if you need Spanish translation and interpretation, we'll be happy to ensure that you are in that group. All right, I am about to open up the rooms. All right, opening up the rooms now. So I will see you all after the meeting. After the activity. All right, welcome back, everyone. We're just waiting on people to come back before we wrap up and discuss next steps, and then we'll be done for the day. I hope everyone had good discussions in their breakout rooms. I know we did. I'm going to share my screen for next steps. And Jameson, if you are back, I'll kick it off to you.
Okie dokie. Yeah, so as Luis said, really just wanted to thank everybody for making time to be here. This was the second meeting that we did. We had an in-person meeting in Yountville last week, and this is the second. Next slide, please. But it's just the beginning of the process. If you haven't filled it out already, we'd love to hear your thoughts in our survey, which closes tomorrow. So please check that out. We have a whole lot of materials on our Conveyo website. You can see the link there or click the scan the QR code. Documents available for review. One of the best ways I think you can continue to be engaged in the process and provide comments as we go on is through participation in the Climate Action Committee of Napa County. We meet every fourth Friday morning from 9:30 to 11:30 or noon here in the County Administration Building on 3rd Street. So I would love to invite you to come there. I some of the faces, I know you already are regular participants, but if there's anybody who hasn't, please join us for that. Next slide. And I think that's about it. Yeah. Any final thoughts from Eric or Luis or David before we close out? Okay, we'll call it a wrap. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.